Harold Brennan looked like any other grandfather in the bleachers at Riverside Little League. Grey hair, gentle smile, cheering for his grandson Tommy's first season. But when three older boys started targeting the quiet kid on the bench, they had no idea they were about to meet one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history. What happened next would change everything at that baseball field forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Elementary's baseball diamond as Harold Brennan adjusted his worn Cardinals cap and settled into the aluminum bleachers. At 72, his weathered hands bore the calluses of decades working construction after his military service, but his steel blue eyes remained sharp as ever. Today marked Tommy's third game of the season, and Harold wouldn't miss it for the world. Tommy Brennan, all of 8 years old with his grandfather's determined jawline, stood nervously at home plate. The boy had been struggling this season, not with his swing, which was actually quite good for his age, but with confidence. Harold watched as his grandson fouled off 2 pitches before striking out, shoulders sagging as he trudged back to the dugout. "Next time, buddy," Harold called out, his voice carrying the same steady tone he'd used to calm nervous Marines decades ago. Tommy looked up and managed a small wave before disappearing into the dugout. The Riverside Rockets were losing 6-2 to the Millbrook Mavericks, but Harold wasn't focused on the score. His attention had shifted to something more concerning happening near the concession stand. 3 boys, clearly older than the players, probably 10 or 11, had been hovering around the edge of the field for the past 2 innings. Harold recognized the type immediately. Bullies looking for easy targets. Their leader, a stocky kid with buzz-cut hair and a permanent scowl, pointed toward the Rockets' bench where Marcus Williams sat alone. Marcus was smaller than most of the other players, with thick glasses that he constantly pushed up his nose. The boy rarely got playing time and seemed content to cheer for his teammates from the sidelines. Harold had noticed Marcus before, reminded him of himself at that age, always watching, always thinking. "Hey, Four Eyes," the buzz-cut kid called out during the 7th inning stretch. "Why don't you actually try to hit the ball instead of warming the bench?" Harold's jaw tightened, but he remained seated. The boy's 2 followers, a lanky redhead and a shorter kid with a Lakers jersey, snickered as Marcus looked away, pretending not to hear. The game resumed, and Harold watched the situation develop with the same patient observation skills that had once made him legendary with a rifle. The 3 bullies weren't just making random comments, they were systematically targeting Marcus, testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before an adult intervened. By the 8th inning, their taunts had escalated. When Marcus fumbled a foul ball that rolled near the dugout, Buzzcut shouted, "Maybe if you could see without those Coke bottles, you might actually be useful." Several parents glanced over with disapproval, but nobody moved to intervene. Harold studied the dynamics carefully. Marcus's parents weren't in the stands, probably working, like so many families these days. The boy was essentially alone, and the bullies knew it. The Rockets managed to score 2 runs in the bottom of the 8th, bringing the score to 6-4. Tommy even managed a solid single that drove in a run, and Harold felt a surge of pride, watching his grandson round first base with a genuine smile. But his satisfaction was short-lived as he noticed the 3 bullies positioning themselves near the dugout exit. As the game ended with a disappointing 7-4 loss for the Rockets, Harold watched the familiar post-game routine unfold. Kids gathered their equipment, parents collected their children, and coaches offered encouraging words about the next game. But Marcus lingered on the bench, slowly packing his glove into a worn equipment bag. The 3 bullies approached with predatory confidence. "Nice game. Bench warmer," Buzzcut said, his voice dripping with fake cheerfulness. "Maybe next season you can try T-ball. That might be more your speed." Marcus stood up, clutching his bag defensively. "Leave me alone, Derek." So Buzzcut had a name. Derek. Harold filed that information away as he observed the interaction unfold. Or what? Derek stepped closer, flanked by his two followers. "You gonna cry to your mummy? Oh, wait. She's probably too busy working to come watch you sit on the bench." Harold saw Marcus's face flush red and recognized the moment when a sensitive kid reaches his breaking point. The boy's hands clenched into small fists, trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I said leave me alone," Marcus repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Derek laughed and shoved Marcus backward. The smaller boy stumbled, dropping his equipment bag and spilling its contents across the dirt. His water bottle rolled under the bleachers, and his glove landed in a small puddle near the dugout. "Oops," Derek said with mock concern. "Looks like Four Eyes is even clumsier than we thought." The redhead and Lakers jersey kid laughed on cue as Marcus scrambled to collect his scattered belongings. Other families were still filtering out of the area, but nobody seemed to notice the drama unfolding near the dugout. Harold had seen enough. He rose from the bleachers with the fluid motion of a man who'd spent decades staying in fighting shape, his construction-hardened frame moving with surprising grace for his age. But instead of heading directly toward the confrontation, he took a different approach. "Tommy!" he called out to his grandson, who was talking with teammates near the parking lot. "Come help me carry something to the car." Tommy jogged over, and Harold quietly positioned them both where they had a clear view of what was happening with Marcus. He wanted his grandson to see how this played out, not just the confrontation, but how a man handles bullies when words fail. Derek had escalated from shoving to actively blocking Marcus from retrieving his glove. Every time the smaller boy reached for it, Derek would kick it slightly further away, earning more laughter from his followers. "Please," Marcus said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." "Ah, poor baby wants to go home," Derek taunted. "Tell you what, crawl over there and get your glove like the little worm you are, and maybe we'll let you leave." Harold felt something cold and familiar settle into his chest, the same icy calm that had once made him one of the Marine Corps' most effective snipers. He'd spent 3 tours in Vietnam, earned a Silver Star, and taken shots that others couldn't even imagine attempting. But standing in this small-town baseball field, watching 3 kids terrorize one smaller boy, he felt the same righteous anger that had once motivated him to protect his fellow Marines. The difference was, now he had the wisdom to channel that anger properly. Harold looked down at Tommy, who was watching the scene with wide eyes. "What do you think we should do, grandson?" Tommy bit his lip, clearly torn between wanting to help and being afraid of getting involved. "Those kids are being really mean to Marcus." "Yes, they are," Harold agreed quietly. "And sometimes, when words don't work, good men have to stand up and make sure the right thing happens." He handed Tommy his car keys. "Go wait by the truck. I'll be there in a minute," as Tommy walked toward the parking lot. Harold Brennan began moving toward the confrontation with the measured pace of a man who had never lost a fight that mattered. Harold's footsteps made no sound on the packed dirt as he approached the group. Decades of moving through hostile territory had taught him to control every aspect of his presence, and right now he wanted to observe before being noticed. Derek had escalated to pushing Marcus again, this time hard enough that the boy fell backward onto the ground. "Get up, crybaby," Derek commanded. "I'm not done with you yet." Marcus struggled to his feet, grass stains now visible on his uniform pants. His glasses had slid down his nose, and Harold could see the boy's hands shaking as he tried to steady them. The redhead had picked up Marcus's glove and was playing keep away with the Lakers jersey kid, tossing it back and forth over the smaller boy's head. "Excuse me, boys." Harold's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. All 4 kids turned toward him, and Harold noted the immediate change in their body language. Derek straightened up, trying to look innocent, while his 2 followers unconsciously stepped back. "Is there a problem here?" Harold asked, his tone conversational, but with an underlying steel that made Derek's eyes dart toward the parking lot. "Probably looking for escape routes. No problem, mister," Derek replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just talking to our friend Marcus here." Harold looked directly at Marcus, whose relieved expression told him everything he needed to know. "Marcus, is that right? Were these boys just talking to you?" Marcus glanced nervously between Harold and Derek. Harold had seen that look before, in villages where civilians were afraid to speak up against local bullies who might retaliate later. The boy was caught between wanting help and fearing the consequences. "Well," Marcus stammered, we were just playing around," Derek interrupted quickly. "Right, Marcus?" The implied threat was clear, and Harold felt his jaw tighten. He dealt with plenty of cowards during his military service, men who preyed on the weak but folded the moment they faced real opposition. Derek was cut from the same cloth, just 40 years younger. "I see," Harold said calmly. He walked over to where the redhead was holding Marcus's glove and extended his hand. "I'll take that." The redhead looked to Derek for guidance, but Derek was studying Harold more carefully now. Something about the older man's bearing, the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his voice, was setting off alarm bells. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Give him the glove, Ryan," Derek said finally. Ryan handed over the glove, and Harold passed it to Marcus. "There you go, son. Why don't you gather up the rest of your things?" As Marcus hurriedly collected his water bottle and equipment bag, Harold turned his attention back to Derek. "What's your name, young man?" "Derek Morrison," the boy replied, some of his earlier bravado returning now that he was talking to an adult who seemed reasonable. "Derek Morrison," Harold repeated thoughtfully. "And these are your friends?" "Ryan Kowalski," the redhead offered nervously. "Jake Martinez," mumbled the Lakers jersey kid. Harold nodded politely, as if he were being introduced at a church social. "Nice to meet you all. I'm Harold Brennan. That's my grandson Tommy over there by the truck." He gestured toward the parking lot, where Tommy was visible waiting by a blue Ford pickup. "Cool," Derek said, his confidence growing. Adults usually just told them to play nice and walked away. This old man seemed different, but Derek was betting he'd follow the same pattern. "Now, Derek," Harold continued in the same conversational tone, "I'm curious about something. Do you play baseball?" The question caught Derek off guard. Yeah. "I play for the Millbrook Mavericks. We just beat these guys 7-4. Congratulations," Harold said sincerely. "That's a good team." "You must be pretty skilled to make the roster," Derek puffed up slightly. "I'm their starting shortstop. Been playing since I was 5. Since you were 5, Harold mused. "That's impressive dedication." "Your parents must be proud." "Yeah, they are," Derek replied, now completely confused about where this conversation was heading. "I imagine they taught you about sportsmanship too," Harold continued. "About treating other players with respect, win or lose." Derek's expression shifted as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd hoped. "Sure, I guess." "You guess," Harold repeated. "Well, Derek, I've been watching you and your friends for the past hour, and I have to say I'm not seeing much sportsmanship. In fact, what I saw looked more like 3 older boys picking on someone smaller and weaker than themselves." The parking lot was nearly empty now, with just a few families still loading equipment into cars. Harold was aware that they essentially had privacy for this conversation, which was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "We weren't picking on anybody," Derek protested. "We were just joking around." "Joking around," Harold nodded. "Is that what you call pushing a smaller boy to the ground? Taking his equipment and making him beg for it back?" Ryan and Jake were now fidgeting nervously, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Derek, however, was starting to show his true colors as his fear transformed into defiance. "Look, old man," Derek said, his voice taking on an edge. "This isn't any of your business. Marcus is a loser who can't even make it off the bench. Maybe if someone toughened him up a little, he'd actually be worth something." Harold felt the familiar coldness settle over him. In Vietnam, that feeling had preceded some of his most difficult but necessary shots. Here, in a small-town baseball field, it meant Derek had just crossed a line that Harold wouldn't tolerate. "I see," Harold said quietly. "So in your opinion, It's acceptable to physically intimidate someone smaller than yourself if you think they're weak. I'm not intimidating anybody, Derek shot back. The kid needs to learn how the world works. Marcus had finished collecting his belongings and was standing nearby, watching the exchange with fascination and growing hope. Harold glanced at him briefly, noting the change in the boy's posture. Sometimes witnessing adults stand up for what's right was as important as the protection itself. Derek, Harold said, turning back to face the boy directly, I think it's time you learned how the world actually works. Harold took a single step forward, and Derek instinctively stepped back. The movement was subtle, but it demonstrated something important. For all his bluster, Derek recognized a predator when he saw one. The world, Harold continued in that same calm voice, is full of people who think they can push others around because they're bigger, stronger, or have more friends. And you know what happens to those people eventually? Derek didn't answer, but Harold could see the wheels turning in his head. They meet someone bigger, stronger, and with better friends, Harold finished. Someone who doesn't appreciate bullies. The silence stretched out for several seconds before Derek found his voice again. You can't touch me. I'll tell my parents. Harold smiled then, and Derek took another involuntary step backward. It wasn't a friendly smile. Derek, Harold said softly, I spent 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sniper. I've faced down enemy soldiers, protected villages from bandits, and dealt with bullies in situations where the stakes were life and death. Do you really think I'm worried about a conversation with your parents? The transformation in Derek was immediate and dramatic. All his swagger evaporated as the reality of who he was dealing with began to sink in. Now, Harold continued, here's what's going to happen next. Derek's face had gone pale, and Harold could see the exact moment when the boy realized this wasn't going to end with a simple scolding. Ryan and Jake were practically vibrating with nervous energy, their eyes darting between Harold and the nearest escape routes. Here's what's going to happen, Harold continued, his voice maintaining that deadly calm. First, you're going to apologize to Marcus. Not one of those fake apologies adults make you give, but a real one. You're going to look him in the eye and tell him you were wrong. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Harold held up a single finger that somehow carried more authority than a shouted command. Second, you're going to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to target someone half your size who was minding his own business. And third, Harold's eyes moved to include Ryan and Jake. You're all going to understand that Marcus is under my protection now. That means if I hear about any of you bothering him again, at school, at games, anywhere, we're going to have a much longer conversation. Derek tried to salvage some dignity. You can't just threaten kids. There are laws. Laws, Harold interrupted, and his smile grew colder. Son, I've operated in places where the only law was who could shoot straighter and move faster. I've protected people who couldn't protect themselves in jungles where making the wrong choice meant everyone died. Do you think suburban anti-bullying policies intimidate me? He took another step forward, and all 3 boys instinctively backed up. But here's the thing, Derek. I don't want to threaten you. I want to educate you. See, bullies like you operate on a simple principle. You pick targets you think can't fight back. You've probably been doing this for years, haven't you? Started small, maybe just name-calling, then gradually worked your way up to physical intimidation. Derek's silence was confirmation enough. The problem, Harold continued, is that you've never learned what happens when your target isn't defenseless. When someone stands up who actually knows how to handle predators. Marcus was watching this exchange with wide eyes, clearly fascinated by seeing an adult systematically dismantle the boys who'd been tormenting him. Harold noticed the change in the boy's posture. Straighter now, less cowering. You want to know what I did in Vietnam, Derek? Harold asked conversationally. My job was to eliminate threats before they could hurt good people. I had to study my targets carefully, learn their patterns, figure out when they were most vulnerable, wait for the perfect moment to act. Harold paused, letting that sink in. Right now, I'm studying you. I know you go to Franklin Middle School because of your Mavericks jersey. I know you live somewhere in the Millbrook district. I know you think you're tough because you've been picking on kids smaller than you for so long that nobody's ever called you on it." Ryan was practically trembling now. "Mr. Brennan, we didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Harold cut him off. "That's the problem. You absolutely meant it. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. You deliberately chose to hurt someone weaker than you because you thought it was fun." He turned his attention back to Derek, who was trying desperately to maintain some semblance of his earlier confidence. "Derek, do you know why snipers are effective?" The question was so unexpected that Derek actually answered.
Because?
"Because they can shoot from far away." "Partly," Harold nodded, "but the real reason is psychological. It's because once a sniper is hunting you, you never know when or where he'll appear. You can't relax, can't feel safe, can't predict when you're vulnerable. It changes how you think about everything." Harold let that hang in the air for a moment. "Now I want you to imagine that feeling every time you think about bothering Marcus or any other kid. Because that's what it's going to be like. You'll never know when I might be watching. At games, at school events, around town, and if I see you reverting to your old habits." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jake finally found his voice. "We get it, Mr. Brennan. We won't bother Marcus anymore." "That's a start," Harold acknowledged. "But understanding and believing are different things. Derek, do you believe me?" Derek stared at Harold for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his pride. Finally, he nodded. "Good. Now about that apology." Derek turned reluctantly toward Marcus, who was still clutching his equipment bag. For a moment, Harold thought the boy might try to deliver another half-hearted fake apology, but something in Harold's presence seemed to compel honesty. "Marcus," Derek said, his voice much quieter than before, "I'm sorry we were picking on you. It wasn't fair and it wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." Marcus blinked in surprise. "Okay," he said softly. Harold studied Derek's face, looking for signs of deception or resentment. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected. Genuine shame. Maybe there was hope for the boy after all. "Derek," Harold said, his tone softening slightly, "can I ask you something?" "Why, Marcus? Out of all the kids here today, why did you choose him?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. He was just sitting there by himself." "And he's small. He was by himself," Harold repeated. "So you thought that made him an easy target, I guess." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "When I was your age, there was a kid in my neighborhood who used to pick on me. Bigger than me, older, had a group of friends who thought everything he did was hilarious. Made my life miserable for about 2 years." Derek looked up, surprised by this admission. "You know what I learned from that experience?" Harold continued. "I learned that bullies are usually cowards. They pick on people they think won't fight back because they're afraid of real conflict. They need easy victories to feel good about themselves." Harold paused, studying Derek's face. "But I also learned something else. Most bullies aren't evil kids. They're just kids who never learned better ways to feel important. Kids who maybe have their own problems at home or school, and taking it out on someone else seems easier than dealing with their real issues." Derek's jaw tightened. And Harold knew he'd hit close to home. "So here's what I'm going to offer you. Derek, instead of just being afraid of me, how about you try being someone worth respecting? Someone who uses his strength to protect people instead of hurting them." "What do you mean?" Derek asked warily. "I mean, Marcus here could probably use a friend instead of an enemy. And I bet if you gave him a chance, you might find out he's smarter and tougher than you think. Sometimes the kids who get picked on are the ones with the most character. They just need someone to give them a chance to show it." Harold gestured toward Marcus, who was listening to this conversation with growing amazement. "Marcus, what position do you usually play when you do get in games?" "Right field," Marcus replied quietly. "Coach says I have good instincts for reading fly balls." "Good instincts," Harold repeated. "That's important in baseball." "Derek, what's the hardest part of playing shortstop?" "Reading the batter and positioning yourself for different situations," Derek answered automatically. "Exactly. It requires intelligence and observation skills. Sounds like Marcus might have some of those same abilities. Maybe instead of making him an enemy, you could help him develop them. Harold could see the wheels turning in Derek's head, processing this completely different perspective on someone he'd written off as worthless. Think about it, Harold concluded. You could be known as the kid who builds people up instead of tearing them down. That's real strength, Derek. That's the kind of strength that lasts. The afternoon sun had shifted lower, casting longer shadows across the baseball diamond as the confrontation entered its final phase. Harold watched Derek process his words, seeing the internal struggle playing out across the boys' features. Ryan and Jake remained silent, clearly content to let their leader navigate this unfamiliar territory. "I don't know how to do that," Derek admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be different, I mean." Harold felt a flicker of respect for the boy's honesty. In his experience, admission of weakness was often the first step toward real strength. "Most people don't know how at first," Harold replied. "It's not something they teach you in school, but it starts with recognizing that other people have value, even if they're different from you." Marcus had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, but now he cleared his throat tentatively. "Derek?" All eyes turned to the smaller boy, who seemed surprised by his own boldness in speaking up. "What?" Derek responded, his tone still carrying traces of his earlier hostility, but lacking its venom. "You're really good at shortstop," Marcus said. "I watched you during the game. You made that diving catch in the fourth inning that saved 2 runs. Derek blinked, clearly not expecting praise from someone he'd been tormenting minutes earlier. "You were watching the game?" "I watch all the games," Marcus replied. "I study different players to see what makes them good. Coach says I need to learn by observing before I can improve my own skills." Harold smiled slightly. Marcus was demonstrating exactly the kind of intelligence and character he'd suspected the boy possessed. Sometimes it just took the right circumstances to bring it out. "What else did you notice?" Derek asked, and Harold could hear genuine curiosity creeping into his voice. Marcus's face lit up. "Your positioning is really smart. Most shortstops your age just react to where the ball is hit, but you move before the pitch, based on the count and what the batter did in previous at-bats. That's advanced thinking." Derek straightened slightly, clearly pleased by the observation. "My dad taught me that. He played college ball." "That's cool," Marcus said. "My dad doesn't know much about baseball, but he helps me practice anyway. He sets up targets in our backyard, so I can work on my accuracy." "Targets?" Ryan spoke up for the first time in several minutes, his curiosity apparently overriding his nervousness. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Different size boxes and cans at various distances. He says precision is more important than power, especially for someone my size." Harold felt something click into place. "Marcus, what does your father do for work?" "He's an engineer at the aerospace plant," Marcus replied. "He designs guidance systems for satellites." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Precision and accuracy. Sounds like those are family values." "Yeah," Marcus said, then looked directly at Derek. "That's why I noticed your fielding. You don't just throw hard to first base. You throw exactly where the first baseman can catch it cleanly. That takes practice and thinking." Derek was now looking at Marcus with something approaching respect. "You really pay attention to stuff like that?" "I pay attention to everything," Marcus replied simply. "Coach says I'll get more playing time once I get stronger and faster. But I figure I can work on the mental part of the game while I'm waiting." Jake, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, suddenly found his voice. "That's actually pretty smart. I never think about that stuff during games." Harold watched this interaction with growing satisfaction. Sometimes the best resolutions came not from punishment or threats, but from helping people see each other as human beings rather than stereotypes. "Derek," Harold said, "what if I told you that Marcus might be able to help you improve your game?" Derek looked skeptical. "How?" "Well," Harold continued, "you're already a good player with natural ability. But Marcus here has been studying the game from a different angle, the strategic side. He's been watching and analyzing while you've been playing and developing instincts. What if you combined those approaches? Marcus looked hopeful but uncertain. I don't know if Derek would want to. Actually, Derek interrupted, surprising everyone, including himself, that might be kinda cool. I mean, nobody's ever really analyzed my playing before. My dad just tells me to play harder when I make mistakes. Harold sensed an opportunity. Marcus, you said your father helps you practice in your backyard. Do you think he'd mind if Derek came by sometime to see this target system you mentioned? Marcus's face brightened immediately. Are you kidding? Dad loves talking about precision and accuracy. He'd probably spend an hour explaining the physics of throw angles and trajectory calculations. Physics? Ryan asked, sounding intimidated. It's not as complicated as it sounds, Marcus assured him. It's just understanding how things work. Like, did you know that the optimal angle for throwing from shortstop to first base changes, depending on how fast the runner is and where exactly you field the ball? Derek was now looking at Marcus with genuine interest. I never thought about that. I just throw as hard as I can. That works when you have time, Marcus explained, his shyness evaporating as he talked about something he was passionate about. But when the play is close, accuracy becomes more important than velocity. A perfect throw that arrives a tenth of a second slower is better than a wild throw that makes the first baseman reach off the bag. Harold could see Derek processing this information, his competitive nature engaging with the challenge of improvement rather than dominance. You know, Derek said slowly, maybe we could help each other. I could show you some of the physical stuff, how to get a quicker release, better footwork, and you could help me understand the strategic side better. Marcus nodded eagerly. And maybe Ryan and Jake could practice with us sometimes. We could work on different game situations. Ryan perked up at being included. That could be fun. I've been wanting to improve my batting average. Marcus probably has theories about hitting too, Derek said. And Harold was pleased to note that there was no mockery in his tone now, just genuine curiosity. Actually, I do, Marcus replied excitedly. I've been tracking pitcher tendencies and count patterns. Did you know that most youth pitchers throw fastballs on 2-1 counts about 70% of the time? Jake's eyes widened. How do you know that? I keep charts, Marcus admitted, then added quickly, I know that sounds weird. It doesn't sound weird, Derek said firmly. It sounds smart. I bet Major League scouts keep charts like that. Harold felt a deep satisfaction watching this transformation unfold. What had started as a bullying incident was becoming something entirely different, the foundation of genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests. Boys, he interjected gently, I think you've discovered something important here. You each have different strengths, and instead of seeing those differences as reasons to compete or put each other down, you're finding ways they can complement each other. Derek nodded, then looked at Marcus seriously. Marcus, I'm really sorry about earlier. Not just because Mr. Brennan made me apologize, but because I was wrong. You're not weak or useless. You're actually pretty cool. Marcus smiled, a real smile this time, not the nervous, apologetic expression he'd worn throughout his ordeal. Thanks, Derek. And you're right about needing to get stronger and faster. Maybe you could help me with conditioning too. Definitely, Derek agreed. Ryan's dad has a batting cage in his garage. We could all practice there. Harold checked his watch and glanced toward the parking lot where Tommy was still waiting patiently by the truck. The boy had witnessed the entire confrontation from a distance, and Harold knew there would be questions on the drive home. Good questions about standing up for others and finding peaceful solutions to conflict. Well, gentlemen, Harold said, it sounds like you have some plans to make. But right now, I think your families are probably wondering where you are. The boys looked around and realized the baseball field was now completely empty, except for them. Oh man, Jake said. My mom's going to kill me. I was supposed to be home an hour ago. As the group began to break up, Derek turned back to Harold. Mr. Brennan, thank you for not just getting us in trouble, for teaching us something instead. Harold studied the boy's face and saw sincerity there. Derek, remember what I said about real strength. You showed some of that today when you chose to listen instead of fight. Keep making choices like that, and you'll become the kind of man people respect rather than fear. Derek nodded solemnly, then turned to Marcus. So, Monday after school? Your backyard? I'll ask my dad tonight, Marcus replied. But I'm sure he'll say yes, as the four boys headed toward the parking lot together, no longer predators and prey, but potential friends united by a shared love of baseball. Harold felt the familiar satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The autumn air carried the scent of falling leaves and hot chocolate. From the concession stand, as Harold settled into his familiar spot in the bleachers, the Riverside Little League Championship game was about to begin, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement from packed stands on both sides of the field. Harold adjusted his Cardinals cap and smiled as he watched the pre-game warm-ups. Tommy, now in his second season, was stretching with his teammates near the dugout. The boy had grown several inches over the summer and developed genuine confidence at the plate. More importantly, he'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for others, lessons that had served him well when he'd encountered his own bullying situation at school 3 months earlier. But Harold's attention was drawn to a more remarkable transformation happening near second base. Marcus Williams, no longer the timid benchwarmer from 6 months ago, was fielding ground balls with fluid precision. His throws to first base were laser accurate, and his positioning showed the kind of strategic thinking that impressed even the most experienced coaches. The thick glasses were still there, but now they seemed to enhance rather than diminish his presence on the field. At shortstop, Derek Morrison was calling out defensive positions to his teammates, his voice carrying leadership rather than mockery. The two boys moved in perfect synchronization during double play practice, their partnership built on months of backyard training sessions and genuine friendship. Incredible, isn't it? Harold turned to see a woman in her mid-30s settling into the seat beside him. She had Marcus's gentle features and intelligent eyes behind similar wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Williams, Harold said, extending his hand. It's good to finally meet you in person. Linda Williams shook his hand warmly. Mr. Brennan, I can't thank you enough for what you did. Marcus tells me you changed his entire life that day. Harold chuckled softly. I think Marcus changed his own life. I just helped create the right circumstances. Well, whatever you call it, the results speak for themselves. Linda gestured toward the field where Marcus was now taking batting practice. 6 months ago, he was afraid to swing at anything. Now look at him. Harold watched as Marcus connected with a pitch and sent it flying into the gap between center and right field. The boy rounded first base with confidence, his running form much improved from hours of conditioning work with Derek. The physical changes are obvious, Harold agreed. But what impresses me more is how he carries himself. He's discovered what he's capable of, Linda nodded. It wasn't just baseball. His grades improved, he joined the science club, and he's even talking about trying out for the debate team next year. It's like someone flipped a switch inside him. Sometimes that's all it takes, Harold replied. One person believing in you when you can't believe in yourself. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the visiting team's dugout. A group of older boys, probably high school age, had gathered and were making loud comments about the players warming up. Harold's trained eye immediately assessed the situation, noting body language and positioning that suggested potential trouble. Looks like the Westfield Warriors brought their own cheering section, Linda observed. Though her tone carried concern rather than enthusiasm, Harold studied the group more carefully. Their leader was a tall, athletic-looking teenager with the kind of swagger that reminded him uncomfortably of Derek 6 months earlier, but amplified by additional years and size. The boy was pointing at various players and making comments that had his followers laughing, though Harold couldn't hear the specific words from his position in the stands. "Tommy!" Harold called out to his grandson. "Come here for a minute." Tommy jogged over, his face flushed with pre-game excitement. "Grandpa, did you see Marcus during batting practice? He's been working with Derek's dad on his swing, and it's amazing how much—" "Tommy," Harold interrupted gently, "what do you know about those older boys over there?" He nodded toward the visiting team's section. Tommy glanced over, and his expression immediately grew more serious. "Oh, them. That's Brad Kowalski and his friends from Westfield High. Ryan's older brother." Harold felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. "Ryan Kowalski, Derek's friend? Yeah, Brad graduated last year, but he still shows up at games sometimes. The guys on the team don't really like it when he comes because he—" Tommy hesitated. "Because what?" Harold prompted. "Because he picks on players he thinks aren't good enough. Last season he made fun of Peter Chen so bad that Peter started crying during a game. Coach Henderson tried to get him to leave, but Brad said he had as much right to be there as anyone else." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Some patterns ran in families, apparently. Has he said anything to you or your teammates today?" "Not yet, but he was looking at Marcus during warm-ups and saying stuff to his friends. I couldn't hear what, but they were laughing." Harold felt the familiar coldness beginning to settle in his chest. "Go back to your team, Tommy, and if Brad or his friends approach any of you players directly, you come get me immediately." "Understood?" Tommy nodded and jogged back toward the dugout. Harold watched him go, then turned his attention back to the group of high school boys. Brad Kowalski was now focused intently on Marcus, who was fielding grounders with his characteristic precision. "Everything all right?" Linda asked, noticing Harold's changed demeanor. "I'm not sure yet," Harold replied honestly. "But I've learned to pay attention when something feels off." The game began with the Riverside Rockets taking the field first. Marcus trotted out to second base with confidence, adjusting his glove and calling out encouragements to the pitcher. Derek took his position at shortstop, and the two boys exchanged a quick fist bump, a ritual they'd developed over months of partnership. The first inning passed without incident, with both teams managing single runs. Marcus handled two routine ground balls flawlessly, his throws to first base drawing appreciative nods from parents in the stands. Harold noticed that Brad Kowalski's group had grown quieter during the defensive display. Though they continued to watch Marcus with obvious interest, in the bottom of the second inning, Marcus came to bat with runners on first and second. The crowd grew quiet as he stepped into the batter's box. Knowing that his hitting had been the weak point of his game for most of the season, that's when Brad Kowalski decided to make himself heard. "Hey, 4 eyes." Brad's voice carried clearly across the field. "Try not to strike out looking this time." Harold saw Marcus's shoulders tense slightly, but the boy stayed focused on the pitcher. The first pitch was outside for a ball, and Marcus let it go without swinging, a sign of improved plate discipline. "Probably can't see the ball anyway." Brad continued, drawing laughter from his followers. "Maybe they should move the pitcher closer." Harold rose from his seat. Linda looked up at him with concern. "Where are you going?" "To handle some unfinished business," Harold replied quietly. As he made his way down the bleachers, Harold heard Marcus connect with the next pitch. The sharp crack of the bat was followed by excited cheers from the Riverside crowd. Harold turned to see the ball sailing over the left fielder's head for a stand-up double. Driving in both runners, Marcus stood on second base with a huge grin, accepting congratulations from his teammates and the crowd. Derek was the first player out of the dugout to celebrate, and Harold felt a surge of pride watching the two boys' friendship in action. But Brad Kowalski wasn't finished. "Lucky hit," he shouted. "Bet he can't do it again." Harold reached the fence separating the stands from the field and began walking toward the visiting team's section. His movement was deliberate and unhurried, but something about his approach caused several parents to notice and look in his direction. Brad was standing on the bottom row of bleachers, giving him additional height and prominence as he continued his commentary. "Come on, Westfield. Don't let these losers show you up." "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly despite its conversational volume. Brad turned toward him with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to adults who would scold but never follow through. "Yeah? I'm Harold Brennan," Harold said, extending his hand in a gesture that appeared friendly but carried subtle undertones that made Brad's friends take an unconscious step backward. "I believe you know my friend Marcus." Brad looked confused. "Who?" "The boy you've been yelling at." "Marcus Williams. Number 12. Recognition dawned on Brad's face, followed quickly by defiance. So, it's a free country. I can cheer for whatever team I want. Absolutely, Harold agreed pleasantly. But there's a difference between cheering for your team and targeting individual children for harassment. Several parents in the nearby stands had turned to listen to the exchange. Harold was aware of the growing audience, but remained focused on Brad. "I'm not harassing anybody," Brad protested. "I'm just having fun." "Fun," Harold repeated. "Tell me, Brad, is it Bradley?" "How old are you?" 18, Brad replied, puffing up slightly. 18. So you're an adult now. And you think it's appropriate for an adult to single out a 10-year-old boy for public mockery? Brad's friends were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. One of them, a shorter boy with curly hair, tugged at Brad's sleeve. "Come on, man, let's just watch the game." But Brad's pride was engaged now. "Look, old man, I don't need some senior citizen lecturing me about what I can and can't say at a baseball game." Harold smiled, and several people in the stands who had witnessed his interaction with Derek 6 months earlier recognized the expression and began paying very close attention. "Senior citizen," Harold mused. "That's accurate, I suppose. I'm 72 years old, which means I've had a lot of years to learn about different types of people. And in my experience, adults who feel the need to intimidate children usually fall into one of two categories." Harold paused, letting Brad wait for the explanation. "The first category is adults, who are fundamentally decent but having a bad day and making poor choices. Those people, when you point out what they're doing, usually feel embarrassed and stop." Brad shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "The second category," Harold continued, "is adults who are bullies by nature. They target children because they're cowards who wouldn't dare behave that way towards someone their own size and age." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Harold could see Brad beginning to realize he was the center of unwanted attention from dozens of parents. "Which category do you think you fall into, Bradley?" Before Brad could answer, Harold continued, "Because if you're category 1, just having a bad day, then this conversation ends here with you deciding to cheer for your team without targeting individual children." Harold's voice remained pleasant, but something in his eyes made Brad take a half-step backward. "And if you're category 2, Harold said quietly, "then you and I are going to have a much different kind of conversation. The kind I used to have with bullies in places where there weren't any referees or parents watching." The implications hung in the air like morning fog. Brad's friends were now actively trying to get him to leave, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of so many witnesses. "You can't threaten me," Brad said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Threaten you?" Harold looked genuinely surprised. "Bradley, I'm not threatening you. I'm educating you. See, I spent 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sniper, and one thing that service taught me was how to recognize different types of threats and respond appropriately." Harold glanced toward the field where the game was continuing, then back at Brad. "Right now, you're not a threat to me. You're barely even an inconvenience. But you are a threat to children who can't defend themselves, and that's something I take very seriously." The curly-haired friend finally succeeded in getting Brad's attention. "Dude, this isn't worth it. Let's just go get something to eat." For a moment, Harold thought Brad might choose the smart path. But 18-year-old pride is a powerful force, and Brad made the mistake of trying to salvage his reputation. "Whatever, Grandpa. You don't scare me," Harold nodded slowly. "I see. Category 2, then. What happened next would be discussed in Riverside for years afterward." Harold didn't raise his voice, didn't make any threatening gestures, didn't even step closer to Brad. Instead, he simply began speaking in the same quiet, conversational tone he'd used throughout the exchange. "Bradley, let me tell you about the last bully I dealt with professionally. His name was Nguyen, and he controlled a village about 30 miles south of Da Nang. He made a living extorting money from farmers and terrorizing anyone who couldn't fight back. Sound familiar?" Harold paused, noting that Brad was no longer looking quite so confident. Nguyen thought he was untouchable because he had armed men protecting him, and nobody had ever successfully stood up to him. He got careless, predictable, Started following routines. Another pause, longer this time. I studied him for 3 weeks. Learned his patterns, figured out when he was most vulnerable. And then, one morning, when he was alone, except for his bodyguards, I eliminated the threat he posed to innocent people. The baseball game continued in the background, but everyone within earshot was now listening to Harold's quiet story. Now, Bradley, I'm not in Vietnam anymore, and you're not Nguyen. But the principle remains the same. Bullies operate until someone with superior training and experience decides they need to stop. Harold smiled pleasantly. The difference is, you have options Nguyen didn't have. You can choose to walk away right now, go enjoy the rest of your evening, and never bother children at baseball games again. Or you can continue to convince yourself that your 18-year-old ego is more important than doing the right thing. Harold checked his watch casually. But Bradley, if you choose the second option, I want you to understand something very clearly. I will know about it. I have friends throughout this community now, and word gets around when adults target children. And if that happens, we'll have another conversation, one that won't take place in front of parents and referees. The silence stretched out for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, the curly-haired friend grabbed Brad's arm decisively. We're leaving, he announced. Now! Brad looked around at the crowd of parents watching him, then back at Harold, who was still smiling that pleasant, patient smile. Whatever Brad saw in Harold's eyes finally penetrated his teenage bravado. This is stupid anyway, Brad muttered, allowing himself to be led away. Let's go find a real game to watch. As the group of high school boys departed, the parents in the stands began returning their attention to the baseball game. Several people nodded approvingly at Harold as he made his way back to his seat. Everything okay? Linda asked as he settled back into the bleachers. Everything's fine, Harold replied. Just a young man learning about consequences. The game continued, with the Rockets building a substantial lead. Marcus had 2 more hits and made several spectacular defensive plays, earning genuine cheers from both sets of fans. Derek's leadership on the field had become obvious to everyone watching, as he coordinated defensive alignments and encouraged younger players. In the 7th inning, with the Rockets leading 8-3, Harold noticed a familiar figure approaching along the fence. Ryan Kowalski, Derek's friend, looked nervous but determined as he walked over to where Harold was sitting. Mr. Brennan, Ryan called out softly. Harold leaned forward. Hello, Ryan. Everything all right? I just wanted to say I'm sorry about my brother, Ryan said, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. He's not usually that bad, but he gets weird at baseball games sometimes. Harold studied the boy's face and saw genuine embarrassment there. Ryan, you're not responsible for your brother's choices, but I appreciate you saying that. He's been different since he graduated, Ryan continued. I think he misses being the star player, so he comes to games and tries to act like he's still important or something. Harold nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Sometimes people have trouble adjusting when their identity is tied to something they can't do anymore. Yeah, Ryan agreed. But that doesn't make it right to pick on kids like Marcus. No, it doesn't, Harold confirmed. And it sounds like you understand that, which suggests you're going to make better choices than your brother did today. Ryan straightened slightly, seeming to take that as a compliment. Yes, sir, I will. As Ryan rejoined his teammates, Harold reflected on the broader patterns he'd witnessed over the past 6 months. Derek's transformation from bully to leader had created ripple effects throughout the local youth baseball community. Other players had begun following his example of supporting rather than targeting teammates who struggled. Parents had started paying more attention to the social dynamics around games, intervening earlier when problems developed. The final inning began with the Rockets ahead, 9-4. Marcus was scheduled to bat third, and Harold could see the boy's confidence as he took practice swings in the on-deck circle. 6 months earlier, Marcus would have been hoping not to embarrass himself. Now he was clearly planning to contribute to his team's victory. When Marcus stepped into the batter's box, the crowd grew quiet with anticipation. The opposing pitcher, perhaps feeling pressure from the deficit, tried to challenge Marcus with a fastball down the middle. The crack of the bat was sharp and clean. Harold watched the ball sail high and deep toward the left field fence. The outfielder backpedaled frantically, but the ball cleared the fence by several feet. Marcus's first home run of the season. As Marcus rounded the bases with a huge grin, Harold felt the deep satisfaction that comes from witnessing genuine transformation. The boy who had once cowered from bullies was now confidently circling the bases after hitting the ball out of the park in a championship game. Derek was the first teammate to greet Marcus at home plate, and their celebration embodied everything Harold had hoped would develop from that confrontation 6 months earlier. Two boys who might have remained locked in predator-prey dynamics had instead become genuine friends who brought out the best in each other. The game ended with the Rockets winning 12-5, claiming their first championship in 5 years. As players and families celebrated on the field, Harold made his way down to congratulate the boys he'd come to think of as extended family. "Mr. Brennan," Marcus called out, running over with his championship medal bouncing against his chest. "Did you see my home run?" "I saw it," Harold replied, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "That was a beautiful swing. All that practice with Derek's father paid off." Derek appeared beside them, sweaty and grinning. "Marcus has been crushing balls all week in practice. I knew he was going to get one out of the park eventually." Harold looked at both boys, noting how naturally they supported each other now. "I'm proud of both of you, not just for winning the championship, but for the way you've grown as people this season. We couldn't have done it without you," Derek said seriously. "If you hadn't stopped me that day," Harold held up a hand. "You stopped yourself, Derek. I just helped you see that you had better choices available." Tommy approached the group, also wearing his championship medal. "Grandpa, Coach wants to get a team picture. Can you be in it?" Harold looked surprised. "Me? I'm not part of the team." "Yes, you are," Marcus said firmly. "Coach Henderson says you're the best assistant coach we never officially hired. Plus," Derek added, "half the team's parents want to thank you for teaching their kids about standing up to bullies and supporting each other." As Harold allowed himself to be pulled toward the team photo, he reflected on the unexpected turns his retirement had taken. He'd never planned to become involved in youth baseball politics or serve as an unofficial mentor to a group of 10-year-olds. But sometimes the most important missions were the ones you didn't see coming. The photographer arranged the team in traditional rows, with Harold standing beside Coach Henderson behind the back row of players. As the camera flashed, capturing the moment for posterity, Harold thought about the lessons these boys had learned that had nothing to do with baseball statistics. They'd learned that bullies were usually cowards who folded when confronted by someone stronger. They'd learned that real strength came from building others up rather than tearing them down. Most importantly, they'd learned that differences in ability, background, or personality weren't barriers to friendship. They were opportunities for mutual growth and support. After the photo, as families began gathering their belongings and heading home, Linda Williams approached Harold one final time. "Mr. Brennan, I know Marcus already thanked you, but I want to add my voice to that. You didn't just save my son from being bullied, you helped him discover who he really is." Harold glanced toward the field where Marcus and Derek were still talking with teammates, their championship medals glinting in the setting sun. "Mrs. Williams, I think Marcus was always who he is now. He just needed the right circumstances to show it." "Maybe," Linda agreed. "But you created those circumstances. And not just for Marcus, for Derek and the other boys too. You turned what could have been a terrible experience into something that made all of them better." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to step in when it matters. And young people smart enough to learn from the opportunity." As the championship celebration wound down and families headed to their cars, Harold walked slowly across the now empty baseball field with Tommy beside him. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, with the first stars beginning to appear overhead. "Grandpa," Tommy said as they reached the parking lot. "Yes? Will you teach me to do what you did today?" With that high school kid, I mean? Harold considered the question carefully. Tommy, what I did today was use experience and psychology to handle a situation that required adult intervention. But the real lesson isn't about intimidating bullies. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and being willing to provide it, even when it's not convenient or comfortable. Tommy nodded seriously. Like you did with Marcus and Derek. Exactly. The most important battles aren't fought with weapons or harsh words. They're fought with wisdom, patience, and the courage to do what's right even when nobody's watching. As they reached Harold's truck, Tommy looked back toward the baseball diamond one more time. Do you think Derek and Marcus will stay friends? Harold followed his grandson's gaze, remembering the genuine affection and mutual respect he'd witnessed between the two boys. I think they'll be friends for life, Tommy. Real friendships forged in adversity tend to last. As they drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Harold reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from concerned grandfather to community mentor. 6 months ago, he'd simply wanted to watch his grandson play baseball. Tonight, he was driving home from a championship game where several young men had demonstrated the kind of character and courage that gave him hope for the future. Sometimes the most important victories happen not on scoreboards, but in the hearts and minds of people willing to grow beyond their limitations. And sometimes those victories required nothing more than one person with the wisdom and courage to step forward when it mattered most. The Marine Corps had taught Harold many things about service, sacrifice, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But it had taken a Little League baseball field to teach him that some of his most important missions would come long after he'd hung up his uniform. In quiet moments, when children needed someone to believe in their potential and show them a better way forward. As the truck's headlights cut through the gathering darkness, Harold smiled and began planning his next conversation with Tommy about the responsibilities that came with strength, wisdom, and the power to make a difference in other people's lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.